You're at the controls of a runaway trolley, barreling down the tracks at high speed. Ahead, you see 5 workers performing maintenance, completely unaware of the danger heading their way. Your heart races as you realize the brakes have failed. But there's a lever next to you. Pull it, and you'll divert the trolley onto a side track. The only problem? There's one person working on that track. Is it better to actively choose to kill one person, or passively allow 5 deaths to occur? Does pulling the lever make you more morally responsible than doing nothing? What if the one person is young and the 5 are elderly? What if the one person is your friend? If you're feeling uncomfortable with this scenario, you're not alone. The trolley problem has been challenging philosophers, ethicists, and students for decades. Right now, autonomous vehicle manufacturers are programming cars to make similar split-second decisions about human lives. According to research published in the Journal of Psychology, 84% of participants in simulated trolley-like scenarios chose to sacrifice one person to save 5. Yet when asked about their comfort with self-driving cars making the same decisions, many people become distinctly uneasy. But what if there was a systematic way to make these impossible choices? A framework that could help us navigate not just dramatic life or death scenarios, but all the complex moral decisions we face in our daily lives. This is where we enter the world of utilitarianism, a philosophical approach that promises to cut through our emotional reactions and cognitive biases to find the most ethical choice in any situation. In the next few minutes, we'll explore how this powerful idea has shaped everything from economic policy to artificial intelligence, and whether it truly offers the moral clarity its supporters claim. When most people first encounter utilitarianism, they imagine a cold, calculating figure mechanically weighing lives in a balance, something like an accountant of morality. They picture someone willing to sacrifice individual happiness for abstract statistical benefits, or worse, a person who sees humans as merely numbers on a spreadsheet. But this common misconception misses the deeply human origins and aspirations of utilitarian thinking. Imagine you're organizing a small family gathering. You have to choose between 2 restaurants, an upscale venue your parents would love, or a casual place your kids would enjoy. Most of us naturally find ourselves doing a quick mental calculation. 4 happy kids versus 2 happy parents, factoring in the intensity of their preferences, the duration of their enjoyment, and even the ripple effects on the rest of the evening. Without realizing it, you're engaging in utilitarian thinking, trying to maximize the overall happiness or well-being of the group. The core principle of utilitarianism, as formulated by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, is deceptively simple. We should act in ways that create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. At first glance, this might seem obvious. Of course, we should try to make as many people as happy as possible. But the implications of this principle can be surprisingly challenging and counterintuitive. Consider how Bentham tried to make this principle concrete. He proposed what he called a felicific calculus, a systematic way to measure and compare different kinds of happiness or pleasure. According to research, Bentham's calculus considered specific criteria, including intensity, how strong the pleasure is, duration, how long it lasts, certainty, how likely it is to occur, propinquity, how soon it will happen, and fecundity, whether it will lead to more pleasure in the future. Think of it like a complex happiness calculator. Just as we can measure temperature or weight Bentham believed we could, at least in theory, measure and compare different kinds of happiness. When doctors decide how to allocate limited medical resources, they often use a metric called Quality Adjusted Life Years, QLEs, to compare different medical interventions. When governments evaluate infrastructure projects, they attempt to quantify benefits to society against economic and environmental costs. But this is where many people start to feel uneasy. Can happiness really be reduced to a mathematical formula? Doesn't this ignore the complexity of human experience? What about justice, individual rights, and personal relationships? These are valid concerns, and as we'll see, even committed utilitarians have grappled with them. The story of utilitarianism is not just about finding a perfect formula for decision-making. It's about understanding the strengths and limitations of trying to make ethics more rigorous and systematic. What makes this exploration particularly relevant today is that we're increasingly relying on actual happiness calculators in the form of algorithms and AI systems to make decisions that affect human well-being. From healthcare resource allocation to autonomous vehicle safety protocols, these systems need clear principles for weighing different outcomes. Understanding utilitarianism's attempts to quantify the unquantifiable isn't just a philosophical exercise. It's becoming a practical necessity in our technological age. Imagine you're in London in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution is transforming society, but also creating unprecedented social challenges. In this environment, a brilliant but eccentric philosopher named Jeremy Bentham has a revolutionary insight. What if we could measure happiness and suffering as precisely as we measure weight or distance? Bentham developed what he called the felicific calculus, a systematic method for measuring pleasure and pain. According to our research, Bentham proposed specific criteria for this measurement: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, and fecundity. At first glance, this might sound absurd. How can you possibly quantify something as subjective as happiness? But Bentham's insight was that while we can't measure happiness directly, we can observe and compare its effects. Just as we can't see gravity directly, but can measure its impact, we can evaluate policies and actions by their measurable effects on human well-being. The real-world impact of this thinking was profound. Victorian social reforms, heavily influenced by utilitarian principles, led to dramatic improvements in public welfare. Research shows that these reforms, including public health initiatives, education requirements, and labor laws, resulted in measurable improvements in population well-being. The Public Health Act of 1845 significantly reduced disease rates by addressing issues related to sanitation, water supply, and housing. By 1900, near universal literacy was achieved through compulsory education laws, a colossal achievement considering the appalling situation of poor children in the 1830s. Today, economists have taken Bentham's basic insight and developed sophisticated tools for measuring societal well-being. Beyond simple GDP, countries now track metrics like the Gross National Happiness Index, which measures well-being across multiple dimensions, including psychological well-being, health, education, and social relationships. The Australian National Wellbeing Framework, for example, uses 50 different economic, social, and environmental indicators to promote a more comprehensive understanding of national prosperity. Organizations like GiveWell use rigorous analysis to compare different charitable interventions. They've found that some interventions can be hundreds or even thousands of times more effective than others at improving human welfare. For instance, according to their research, providing basic emergency obstetric care, can generate $71 worth of benefits for every dollar spent. This brings us to a crucial question. If we can measure and compare different kinds of happiness or welfare, what does that mean for how we should act? Should we always choose the action that produces the greatest measurable benefit? Imagine being accused of creating a philosophy worthy only of swine. This was exactly the criticism leveled at Jeremy Bentham's original version of utilitarianism. Critics argued that by treating all pleasures as equal, Bentham's theory suggested that a life of simple physical pleasures was just as good as one filled with intellectual and artistic achievement. Mill's breakthrough was to argue that there are qualitatively different types of happiness, what he called higher and lower pleasures. Think of it like different frequencies of light. Just as violet light has a higher frequency than red light, Mill believed that intellectual or spiritual pleasures were inherently superior to purely physical ones. But was this just philosophical speculation? Recent neuroscience has provided fascinating insights into Mill's distinction. Research has shown that pleasure involves multiple brain regions and systems, which can explain why intellectual or mental pleasures might be perceived as qualitatively different from bodily or physical ones. The experience of solving a complex problem, appreciating art, or engaging in meaningful conversation activates different neural circuits than those involved in basic physical pleasures. Consider a modern example: binge-watching Netflix versus reading a challenging book. The Netflix session might provide more immediate pleasure, what Mill would call a lower pleasure. It's easily accessible and requires little effort. But reading the book, while perhaps less immediately gratifying, might offer what Mill called a higher pleasure, one that engages our mental faculties and contributes to our personal growth. This distinction has profound implications for how we think about happiness and well-being. Modern economists and policymakers have started incorporating these insights into their measurements of societal welfare. For instance, New Zealand's Living Standards Framework includes metrics across multiple dimensions: economic, social, human, and natural capital. But here's where things get really interesting. Mill argued that people who have experienced both higher and lower pleasures tend to prefer the higher ones, even if they're harder to achieve. As he famously put it, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." This refinement of utilitarianism raises challenging questions for our modern world. In an age of endless digital entertainment and instant gratification, are we prioritizing lower pleasures at the expense of higher ones? When AI systems optimize for user engagement, are they promoting what Mill would consider genuine happiness? The difference between Bentham's and Mill's versions of utilitarianism reminds us that even seemingly simple principles like maximize happiness can contain hidden complexity. As we continue to develop AI systems and craft policies aimed at promoting human welfare, understanding these distinctions becomes increasingly crucial. Utilitarian thinking isn't just an abstract philosophical exercise. It shapes crucial decisions that affect millions of lives. Let's look at how this plays out in some of the most challenging issues we face today. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic, where policymakers worldwide faced unprecedented ethical dilemmas. How do you balance economic activity against public health? When vaccines were scarce, who should get them first? While research shows that explicit utilitarian cost-benefit analyses weren't the sole basis for most COVID-19 policy decisions, utilitarian principles influenced many choices. Healthcare systems had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, essentially calculating how to save the most lives with limited resources. Modern healthcare systems use metrics like quality-adjusted life years, QALYs, to compare different medical interventions and make funding decisions. It's a concrete example of Bentham's felicific calculus in action, a way to quantify and compare different outcomes to maximize overall welfare. But perhaps the most fascinating modern application of utilitarian thinking is in AI ethics, particularly in autonomous vehicles. Remember our opening trolley problem? Well, autonomous vehicle manufacturers are literally programming cars to make similar decisions. According to research, when surveyed about programming autonomous vehicles, people tend to lean towards minimizing overall harm, a utilitarian approach. However, these same people often express discomfort when thinking about being passengers in vehicles programmed this way. Environmental policy offers another crucial example, particularly when it comes to climate change. Modern utilitarians calculate the welfare of future generations in climate policy through computer models that solve for the distribution of emissions reductions across the world that would maximize well-being. These models weigh the interests of every citizen of the world equally, focusing on well-being impacts rather than simply economic outcomes like GDP. Research published by Rutgers University shows that this approach can lead to better outcomes for human development, equity, and the environment. Consider a personal example: choosing where to donate money. The effective altruism movement, founded on utilitarian principles, uses rigorous analysis to compare different charitable interventions. Their research shows that some interventions can be hundreds of times more effective than others at improving human welfare. For instance, Population Services International found that just $38.96 can give a mother and her child a year of healthy life. These real-world applications reveal both the power and the limitations of utilitarian thinking. While it provides a systematic framework for making difficult decisions, it also raises challenging questions. How do we account for uncertainty in our calculations? The complexity of these questions might make us nostalgic for simpler moral rules. But in a world of limited resources and competing needs, we can't escape the need to make difficult trade-offs. Understanding utilitarian thinking helps us make these trade-offs more consciously and systematically, even if it doesn't provide all the answers. Before we dismiss utilitarianism as too cold or calculating, let's address its biggest criticisms head-on. After all, if this framework is going to help us make better decisions, we need to understand both its strengths and its limitations. The first major criticism is that utilitarianism is simply too demanding. If we're truly supposed to maximize happiness for the greatest number, shouldn't we give away most of our money to help the global poor? Shouldn't we spend every free moment working to improve the world rather than enjoying ourselves? This isn't just a theoretical concern. Research into the psychological effects of applying strict utilitarian thinking shows it can lead to reduced emotional connection and increased detachment from personal relationships. Then there's the criticism that utilitarianism ignores individual rights. Critics argue that by focusing solely on aggregate outcomes, we might justify sacrificing individuals for the greater good. Think back to our trolley problem. While most people agree that diverting the trolley to save 5 lives at the cost of 1 might be justified, They become much more uncomfortable when asked about pushing someone onto the tracks to achieve the same result. According to behavioral studies, this reflects a deep-seated moral intuition about individual rights that utilitarianism seems to ignore. But modern utilitarians have developed sophisticated responses to these challenges. Peter Singer's effective altruism movement offers a practical example. Instead of demanding that people give everything away, it encourages them to maximize the impact of whatever they choose to give. Their research shows remarkable results. Organizations like GiveWell have directed over $172 million to highly effective charities since their founding in 2007, demonstrating that even modest commitments to utilitarian principles can have significant positive impacts. As for individual rights, contemporary utilitarians argue that protecting individual rights usually leads to better outcomes overall. They point out that a society that respects individual rights tends to produce more happiness and well-being in the long run than one that regularly sacrifices individuals for the greater good. This is supported by research into how different cultures' happiness metrics align with various social systems. Societies that protect individual rights generally show higher levels of overall well-being. Perhaps the most practical response comes from what we might call practical utilitarianism, using utilitarian thinking as one tool among many, rather than as an absolute rule. This approach recognizes that while we can't perfectly calculate all consequences, we can use utilitarian reasoning to help us make better decisions. For instance, when economists evaluate public policies, they use various metrics to measure societal well-being, including economic indicators, social relationships, and environmental factors. The Australian National Wellbeing Framework, for example, uses 50 different indicators to promote a more comprehensive understanding of national prosperity. This balanced approach acknowledges that while pure utilitarianism might be too demanding for everyday life, its insights are invaluable for making better decisions. It's like having a powerful telescope. You wouldn't use it to navigate your living room, but it's essential for understanding the broader universe. Similarly, utilitarian thinking might not be necessary for every small decision, but it becomes increasingly valuable as the stakes and complexity of our choices increase. The key is finding the right balance between utilitarian calculation and other moral considerations. As artificial intelligence becomes more prevalent in decision-making, understanding how to strike this balance becomes increasingly crucial. We need frameworks that can handle both the quantifiable aspects of welfare and the more intangible elements of human flourishing. We've journeyed from a runaway trolley to the complex moral calculations that shape our modern world. Utilitarianism, with all its strengths and limitations, offers us a powerful framework for thinking about ethical decisions. But rather than giving you a neat conclusion, let's end with some questions to challenge your own moral reasoning. First, consider how you would apply utilitarian thinking to evaluate a universal basic income policy. How would you weigh immediate economic costs against potential long-term benefits in well-being? What metrics would you use to measure success? Remember Bentham's criteria of intensity, duration, certainty, and propinquity of benefits. Second, reflect on a time when your moral intuition conflicted with utilitarian calculations. Perhaps you felt it was wrong to sacrifice one person to save 5 in our trolley scenario, even though the math clearly suggests it would maximize overall welfare. How do you resolve this tension between emotional moral intuitions and rational calculation? Third, If you were redesigning utilitarianism for the modern world, what modifications would you make? How might you incorporate Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures while addressing concerns about individual rights? Consider how modern metrics like the Gross National Happiness Index or quality-adjusted life years have already evolved beyond simple pleasure calculations. Finally, think about how a utilitarian approach to climate change might differ from other ethical frameworks. How would you weigh the interests of future generations against present costs? What role should uncertainty play in these calculations? Remember that modern utilitarians calculate the welfare of future generations through computer models that consider global well-being rather than just economic outcomes. These questions don't have easy answers, but wrestling with them helps us develop more nuanced ethical thinking. As we face increasingly complex global challenges, from artificial intelligence to climate change, we need frameworks that can help us navigate difficult trade-offs while remaining true to our deepest values. Whether or not you ultimately embrace utilitarianism, understanding its insights and grappling with its challenges can make us all better decision makers. After all, in a world of limited resources and competing needs, we can't escape the need to think systematically about how to create the greatest good for the greatest number.